Now, I said a couple lessons ago that the Declaration of Independence changed a lot of things. One of the things that it changed was the political structure of the United States. Up to that point, every single colony that existed had a charter from either Parliament or the King of Britain. But now with the Declaration of Independence, all those colonies no longer had any political structure. So Congress suggested that all the states create a state constitution, and further, that those states elect people to Congress to form the first Constitution of the United States. This first Constitution was called the Articles of Confederation, and it brought all 13 states together in what was called a confederation. The main goal of the Confederation was to give Congress certain powers, but not to give it too much. The states feared one entity becoming too powerful. After all, Parliament had been too powerful. So they created the Articles of Confederation to make sure the federal government would not become too powerful. Each colonial charter then was replaced with a state constitution, and that state constitution was then valid, binding, and permitted the federal constitution. It was a very complicated procedure. Congress began drafting the Articles of Confederation in July of 1776, but they did not actually finish until November of 1777. And even though the Articles were finished in 77, it would be 4 years before all the states agreed to the Articles. Nevertheless, the country had to run as if the Articles were legal, because it was a time of war. It's important to realize that the Articles of Confederation specifically stated that every state retained all of their own rights except for a very specific number of rights that were given to Congress. For example, the right to wage war and to make a continental army, and also to sue for peace and to parley with Britain or other international organizations. They were also allowed to issue a letter of marque, as we saw when we were talking about privateers, and they were allowed to negotiate with Native Americans as well. Congress was supposed to create a post office, for example, and they were also supposed to create currency. They had a few other roles as well, but there were some limitations to the Articles of Confederation. Specifically, they were unable to tax, and that was the most important problem. The local states could tax, but Congress could not. Meanwhile, Congress is trying to run a war, and all of those soldiers need equipment, and they need paid. But Congress was not able to tax anyone. Instead, they had to request money from the states, and the states were always late, and most of the time, they didn't provide the amount of money requested. There was another rule, and that was as soon as war is over, Congress is not allowed to have a standing army. This was important because remember, the colonists did not trust a standing army. And then the other main problem was that there was no executive branch. Now, if you think about it, Congress could make laws, but it had no way of making sure that the laws were enforced to execute the law. So without an executive branch, they had to kind of hope that the states would go along. Most of the time, the states did not. So essentially, there was only one government body, Congress, but that body did not have the power to fund itself or make sure its rules were followed. Several problems manifested. Congress was unable to fund soldiers or the supplies. Often food and clothing and armaments were in short supply. Another problem was that Congress repeatedly requested these supplies from the states, but couldn't receive those supplies. Congress was also unable to pay soldiers over the course of the war and defaulted on promises that they had made. And after a while, that led to desertion as soldiers would leave the Continental Army. And also whenever they were negotiating with foreign powers, often the foreign powers would ask for certain things, and Congress was unable to promise those things because other states were actually involved. So the Articles of Confederation has some significant limitations and created some clear problems going forward. Without an executive branch and a legislative branch and a judicial branch, it became very clear that that government was too weak, and although it might be able to survive the war, it would not be able to promise the future of the United States. A new constitution would eventually be needed. My main point in this lesson was to look at how a new nation needed to legally establish itself, and it also needed to defend itself, to appear united. But fear of a strong central government hamstrung the new United States Republic.